Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
Banking, so hot right now.
It's so hot right now.
I
Or
feel
not.
like, or the opposite of hot. This week, a couple of things coming down on banking. Yesterday, woke up to the First Republic Bank being seized by the federal government and sold to JP Morgan Chase. So another bit of fallout there. I think it's the second largest bank failure, right behind good old Washington Mutual. So yeah, what's old is new again here. But I don't want to talk about that as much as I want to talk about safe banking. That also came up last week, reintroduced, but this time it's a bit different, right?
Reintroduced. Yeah, I mean, I will just quickly on the banking because I think the banks that are the most at risk, because, you know, when SVB failed, the first 24 hours, the question everyone was asking and some people thought was that it was idiosyncratic to that bank because of their poor work around lending, and that they really got greedy and ahead of themselves and had no risk officer actually in the seat. It then, of course, exposed that it was much bigger than that. And now, I mean, First Republic Bank has been, I'm surprised it took this long, frankly, for this to occur. But Jamie Dimon grabs another one and keeps going. But I think the bigger thing that I'm watching for our industry, and it doesn't really matter if you don't own the bank stocks, but I would just watch your regional banks to see what's going to happen. Now, the FDIC has said that they will protect all deposits, and I think they should, because if as depositors we're not protected, then what the hell is the point of having a bank account?
Right.
Just because the greedy management teams just go ahead and get over their skis and really show that they're actually poor investment managers, frankly. But in terms of our industry, the things I'll watch is that there could be, just like 0809, the consolidation coming from these hundreds of regional banks into larger organizations. And so we should all just watch and hope that what we're about to talk about next starts to take shape and actually can get done, because acquirers of banks, that's how I've lost a few accounts over the years, is when a larger bank acquires and says you have to get rid of your cannabis book of business. So we should all just be mindful of that as we watch this unfold, because I don't think First Republic Bank is the last in the dominoes to go, and I do think we'll see a lot of consolidation. So just for everyone out there, keep an eye on what's happening with your regional bank. I don't think we're out of the woods here. So with that in mind, here we go again. This time does feel a little different, but you know, that old expression that President Bush famously distorted, but fool me once, shame on you, fool me 7+ times, shame on me. So don't fool us this time. But you know what I like about the way this was introduced is it's actually going through the normal procedural approach within the Senate. And so what was cool is it was a group of bipartisan lawmakers. And again, Senator Daines from Montana was one of the ones to take up the mantle on this. And it's just a very stripped down Just Safe Banking Act. And it was introduced, and it will be going through a hearing process, which again, you know, and Morgan pointed this out, it's like kind of crazy that of all these times, this is the first time for it to go through the normal process. So from what I understand, more bipartisan support has emerged around this, and we'll see, you know, what happens. So yeah, so it's been tweaked since the last session. Let's see. So who introduced it, Cy? You have the names.
Yeah, so bipartisan group, Senator Merkley of Oregon, Steve Daines of Montana, Dave Joyce, Ohio, and Blumenauer of Oregon. I think those are the names that were associated with it, but there's been a lot of other senators that have come out on places like Twitter and talked about how they're for safe banking here. So it is a different monster in that sense, right? That it's you know, introduced in this manner, which is you know, I think a reason to be optimistic, even though after 8 times it is that feeling of like, you know, don't get my hopes up because I'm just gonna get, you know, crushed again here. But
Yeah.
I think that's a good starting point here to see a
Mhm.
few Republicans, a few Democrats on this legislation here. But I do want to talk about, the timing of all of this, and it kind
Yes.
of does. I mean, one of the things that I think adds some complexity here is that, the current banking climate, right? Like, to your point, I know with First Republic, I saw some things saying, this is the what is it, the beginning of the end, but maybe it's more like the end of the beginning, right? With this stuff.
Yeah.
And back in March, late March, when all this stuff was really kind of happening with SVB and Signature, um, any legislation, it was basically a casualty of that,
Mhm.
right? The Senate's really got to figure out this banking problem, and the Senate banking chairman Brown has postponed, safe banking hearings so he can like focus on what's going on with the banking system in general. And so
Mhm.
like this is coming out at the same time. Well, I guess this came out last week, safe, and then this week First Republic happened, or over the weekend.
Mhm.
And so I'm sure, it's just like a good opportunity, I feel like, for the other side, the opponents to any sort of reform here, to point to, like, and say, is this really the right time to be talking about marijuana? You know what I mean? Like, they'll definitely try and deflect and say, we've got, bigger challenges in banking. I just feel like, it's too bad, right, that we have all this banking drama going on when we're trying to pass some banking reform when it comes to, our industry, cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are some things we can watch around this. I mean, just even right now, I was just noticing like the SPDR, the S&P Regional Banking ETF is way down today. I mean, there's signs of lack of confidence. So to your question of where we are, is important. But what I think here is that, even so we know Senator Daines, like I had a conversation with his staffer. He's a Republican from Montana. We have Dave Joyce, who's a Republican. Daines is not substantially pro legalization, but he is pro business being treated as business. Is this business is big enough of cannabis that it should be through the normal channels. And this is also consistent with my conversation with the CEO of the American Bankers Association, Rob Nichols, who I'm actually meeting with in a couple of weeks in DC. He's been a long champion of just pragmatic and simple banking support for this industry. And this is going to continue to be really important to us. But I do worry about these other issues, like to your point, the debt ceiling issues. Like Yellen is yelling about the debt ceiling, and we're going to find out what the deal is there very, very quickly, as if it's already not happening this morning while I'm working. But and then we've got this other crisis. They're going to have to navigate how to work through this to protect the depositors and to keep things going, because the downstream impact also of losing all these regional banks is, by the way, lending. So, for example, Signature Bank, which is now Flagstar, which had been taken over by the FDIC right that same weekend of SVB, they have done, I think, zero new loans
Wow.
since
Zero
January.
new
So,
loans.
yeah. So
Amazing.
there's this lending piece to it, which it's as if we already had lending support. No, we really barely do as an industry, but this becomes a bigger issue. And I remember this like during September 11th times and then 0809 with the companies I worked with. Even if you had a long running, 15, 20-year successful business, sometimes those banks will just call your line of credit because they're just pulling all risk off the table. And it's a broad strokes approach, and it's disappointing because they go broad strokes in one way where they go very risk on. And like, for example, SVB had no covenants on their freaking debt, venture debt. Like, are you guys crazy? And then they go the other way. So it's just pendulum swings of greed and then fear. So that's kind of, where we are on this. So we're just, we hope that it remains somewhere in the priority stack, but I do worry about where it actually ends up landing. So I mean, and this is politics 101, there's um driving things forward. And to your question at the beginning of the podcast is like, do we need to, will dollars make it more of a priority? I mean,
Mhm.
you would think keeping businesses running and employing people, especially in this environment. I mean, Since last week, we've thousands and thousands of jobs are being cut from various companies. Today, 3,000 from Morgan Stanley. I mean, businesses across the board, and it's not just cannabis, it's also other businesses kind of adjacent to us, like hospitality and things like that. So retail. So, these are things these lawmakers should care about, but I just sometimes don't understand their priorities.
Yeah. So we've got the debt ceiling, debt crisis coming. It seems like there's already a battle, setting up for that, which happens. It's, different climate kind of with the current makeup of the legislature. So we'll see.
Hmm.
But I think that's going to be a distraction. And then just the other week, right, the Senate rejected the bipartisan bill around the VA, the Veterans Affairs Department, to perform clinical
Hmm.
trials on veterans with chronic pain and PTSD. And that was, pretty much on party lines, like 57-42, needed 60. Um, and it's really disappointing. And when you see some of the language, right, it's like, we have these veterans and we're here, um, talking about marijuana is like, the only thing for them or whatever, like being real dismissive of it. But I was just like recently, are you familiar with like the Sleep Foundation? It's like a nonprofit, on sleep and better sleep habits. And it's been around forever.
Yeah.
And I saw they had an article on cannabis and sleep, which is interesting, right? Because it's like there's a lot of anecdotes about it, but like what's really going on. And in the article, they talk about for people with certain conditions such as chronic pain or PTSD, cannabis may help them fall asleep faster, wake up less during the night, and enjoy better sleep quality overall. And it has to do with like REM sleep, um, and the impact. I
Hmm.
think REM can be really hard for PTSD. It's when you have a lot of those vivid dreams, and if you have PTSD and you're a veteran, like that's the waking up screaming. And cannabis seems to suppress some of that REM sleep. You don't have those heavy dreams. And so there's an article from a nonprofit, and it's just like dismissed. And you'd think that for the veterans, it's like, well, let's just at least study it. And other pushback on that trial was it's a self-selection trial. Like, are we really sure it's going to be representative? It's like, Jesus, just like do some research, like allow some research to happen. But no, they won't, right? And so that makes me a little anxious, that if they can't do that for our veterans, um, what does it mean for this bill?
Well, there's a couple of things to know about that too. First of all, I'm so upset about this, and primarily because I do care about the veterans. I think they are one of they're a population in our country that should be treated 180 degrees better than how they're treated by our country. I mean, considering the big risks they take and the things they give up to support, our pursuit of preserving our way of life, as they say at Yankee Stadium. So, I think, and if you look at Canada, they've done the very opposite, where they leaned in on the support of PTSD right away from a medical cannabis standpoint. Now, all we're asking for is research, but this is a great juxtaposition to talking about the things that can go wrong with safe, even if does make perfect logical sense to pass it. And if today, even if we had the 60 votes, things like what happened on the Veterans Affairs Committee could happen, which is that the chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee is a Democrat from Montana. His seat is up for election this year. And from what I
Mm,
understand, that was how the core votes got lost on this, was that the Republicans did not want for him to have this win because it would be a big win and they really want his seat. And so this is how political machinations can completely throw off the process. And, I kind of went after one of the politicians on Twitter because he said something to the effect of, people serve in our country, and the best we can do is offer cannabis. This
right.
is like the best. And so then I cited this study about the 52% increase in opioid related deaths for the veteran population, which is one of the most impacted on the opiate crisis in our country. And so I'm sorry. For a minute, I thought it was maybe related to pharma lobbying against us, but I actually
Mm,
had a really illuminating discussion with Jason Wild, who has a pharma background. And he said he doesn't think it's that, because a lot of the pharmaceutical products, this was illuminating to me, that would be at risk from cannabis reform, because we do know these things decline, opiates decline in markets where we have medical marijuana programs. A lot of them are past the point of their patent, so they're not they're now generics. And so they're not as interesting to the pharmaceutical companies who've now moved on to like these anti-obesity drugs, which is like $130
Oh yeah.
billion market. Yeah. So for what it's worth, because I know we're always kind of curious about the role of pharma in the federal process that we have. So who knows if that's right, but I thought it was a more informed opinion than mine because he does actually have pharma experience. And so I appreciate any color I can get on how this goes. But yeah, just to share, I mean, it was just as simple as a seat at stake for an
Crazy.
election could
Not
cost,
surprising,
yeah,
but
yeah,
unbelievable. Yeah.
unbelievable. And I do really feel for the veterans on that. I mean, the least we can do is research to understand it because I know, anyone who's gone through pretty acute grief, sleeping is hard when you go through that, and sleep disruption and the dreams that can occur. And cannabis has been the only thing that has not only helped me with sleep, but has not interfered with my life the next day. I mean,
Right.
try taking an Ambien coupled with anything else. And I mean, I've almost, I tried Ambien a couple times and the hangover from it was so intense. There's no way. There's no way
Yeah, and if you have
I could function.
a
Yeah.
glass of wine with it too, it's an added
Yeah.
craziness. Yeah, no, for sure. There's all sorts, and so yeah, it's disappointing, but I think that it does point to how fragile this is, even from a bipartisan perspective. But you mentioned Daines and his position, and when he was talking about the safe, introducing this exact bill, he talked about it's about education, educating folks, and really was encouraging basically the industry to pour a bunch of lobbyists into Congress so that we can educate what this really is, because he's basically saying that it's not a proxy vote for endorsing federal legalization. It's totally unrelated, was what he was quoted saying. This is about solving a problem that's facing our financial service businesses or legal cannabis businesses and other ancillary industries, from plumbers to brokers, right? And even us, like, we're ancillary to it. We're not like a direct operator, right? Like a license holder, but obviously impacts us. But it does impact those plumbers, those brokers, everything in between. So that's an interesting angle, but doesn't make me really optimistic about any sort of broader legalization ever happening, with that kind of language. But as far as safe banking, maybe they can get behind that. Like, it's just supporting businesses. This is supporting jobs. But I thought it was an interesting statement from him, and I thought, like, like, is it just a matter of we just need a ton of lobbyists, as crass as that sounds? You'd think that they would be in front of this, but is that, I mean, is he right? Just flood the place with lobbyists to get this across the line.
I mean, as I've said since Safe failed to get it done in 2022, I was like, who do we need to go and like drink with on the Hill? I mean, I just feel
Right.
like it's like we just got to get in front of people more and more and make it a priority. And if we don't have as much money as pharma and alcohol and guns to point at at these politicians, then we just have to be the squeaky wheel and take it step by step. But I do worry about what gets rolled into these things that then even people, I mean, even someone like Daines who supports banking, if something else gets rolled into this, you know, who
Right.
knows where they knocked out on the vote. So
And
we
there's
just have
for
to be
sure,
careful.
yeah, there's talk about that happening, right? Where
Hmm.
Merkley, who was, one of the sponsors, mentioned the hearing, and then there will be a chance to add provisions like Hope and Graham Acts, which we've talked about in the past, before final
Hmm.
passage. Schumer was on Twitter saying, how excited he is to see this legislation, which is a new song and dance from him from the CAOA that he was trying to do forever ago, it feels like. And now he's
Hmm.
like, for safe banking, but he did make a point to say, quote, I'm making it a top priority to ensure it contains social equity provisions to undo harm caused by the war on drugs. So I don't know, what
Hmm.
the chance of that actually happening is, but the fact that he's going to go down that path again with this just, introduces risk. So then, just to kind of like, I don't know, close the loop on this, you've got the banking situation with First Republic and potentially more coming, and the distraction there, and the opportunity for opponents to point to that. You've got
Yeah.
debt crisis, which is going to suck all the air out of the room. I think, as you know, the government's being held hostage again with, hey, we're not going to pay our bills, and there's stuff happening in the House that looks, rough. That's going to, be a thing. You have what happened with the veterans, obviously. You have the fact that we don't have a ton of
100%.
lobbyists walking around because the money is tight, in this space because of the federal position, because of things like banking and tax deductions and all the rest that this will fix. So kind of hands tied there. And then there's opportunity for, provisions to get introduced. Like, what if we see this thing with Hope and Graham, attached to it, which would be great if it could get through, but it just seems
It'd be
like
great.
this is what prevented it from happening before, because they'll just point to, well, this is just a way to introduce social equity, and we don't believe in it. What was a common refrain from the opponent. So like I'm optimistic. This is, it's like better than not getting introduced, but I feel like there's plenty of headwinds yet on this stuff that's going to make it tougher. From the market perspective, I know, Poseidon, you guys are really close to this. Like, there was a bit of a pop, right, when this news came out, and then did it kind of settle back down, or do we see kind of sustained lift from the news when this was introduced?
I mean, for us, we saw a sustained lift for 2 market days is like, that's a streak, baby. But today we're back down the drain because I think there's like algorithmic selling that goes on around just risk off. And like
Yeah.
right now, like I just saw that Western Alliance and PacWest, the regional banks, have sold off over 25% today. I mean, I don't know how the common stock in these things is going to be worth anything by the time this is all over, but so I think if there is any kind of algo tied to our industry, it just goes risk off, sell off, and these correlations go to 1, which means that everything moves together. So it's an interesting time and a very frustrating one. And this is where, though, we talk about what happens with, like, if TerraSend can find its way to the TSX, which is the listed exchange up there, the senior exchange. If we can find a way to these bigger exchanges, especially when you look at the volumes trading. So these things move on everything. And we also know there were a lot of shorts out there. So when news like this happens, and it kind of happened quickly, that introduction of
Yeah.
this new of the SAFE Act, the shorts, run to cover, and there were some naked shorts too, which is like, well, the tide goes out and your swimming trunks are down. So there you go. But that's financial jargon, but it's it's an interesting time to watch the market dynamics. I didn't know, honestly. I did not know if the markets would move so much on any news around SAFE because we've been burnt so many times, but
Yeah.
apparently they do.
After it's the eighth time here. I was surprised too. But there's hope. There's hope. Never say never.
And maybe Graham. Never
Well
say
done. Well
never.
done.
Thanks.
Um,
So what's going
yeah.
on the states level, though?
Yeah. So, the legalization report, it feels like everyone wants to get on the train of legalizing cannabis, except for the federal government. Minnesota Senate, the big news coming out of Minnesota was that they did advance an adult use marijuana legalization bill, but more work is required before it can become law. That work is basically reconciling it with a House bill that was also passed. And they have to put that into some sort of like single package, right? They can't have 2 bills. So they got to reconcile that. And I think there are some tax differentiation, some regulatory differences as part of the bills, but it doesn't sound like it's insurmountable. It did pass by one vote, which isn't, super great, but, at least it passed. It will be interesting to see. There's already some pushback from like the hemp groups that are, I think, doing pretty well in markets like Minnesota with the loosey-goosey framework that they have, this whole like quote unquote accidental legalization, which doesn't sound like it was accidental. That was kind of what the Republican side said when they, agreed to it, not realizing
Yeah.
they agreed to it. But it introduced some really interesting things that, we've talked about on the podcast, where restaurants could sell THC seltzers, drinks alongside beers, because of the framework. And Minnesota did this because they saw this influx of Delta 8 and hemp derived Delta 9 that was all legal, in their state, and they wanted to get some sort of structure around it. But now they're going to take it to the full extent of the adult use, like we see in other markets, which is great. I don't know what it means for that kind of world that exists now, but this hemp group seems to be pushing back, which is kind of crazy to me. It seems very short-sighted and obviously, self-motivated that, they probably have a good business and they want to, stop this from happening because of that. It's like California legalization way back in like 2010 when it failed and everyone was like, oh, Humboldt's going to totally vote for this. The Emerald Triangle, everyone's going to want legal cannabis. And then that was the areas, that voted it down, right? Because they had a robust infrastructure for it. And so we're already kind of seeing that happen. So it's good that Minnesota's getting in front of it before it gets too far along. The same thing happened in Washington, D.C. with, their gift shops or whatever, where you can go buy a hat and it comes with an eighth. They've got a whole like a trade union type structure, supporting those businesses. And so the longer those things go, people create industries. I mean, just like us, in legal markets with like, we're creating industries, even though, there's federal limitations. So it's good that they're getting in front of it. I don't know what it's going to look like, but it is good news to see that, it's progressing in the legislature in Minnesota.
Well, this is also a learning from New York. Like, I'm all for decriminalizing weed and think it should be completely across the board. But if you want to have a legal, regulated, and taxed program with testing requirements and everything else, then you have to stand up a commercial infrastructure around it very quickly. And if you don't, someone else will. And so look what the vape shops in New York did. And so this
Right.
is the problem. And so Texas, actually, this is a very active and live
True.
discussion about what will happen there too. So these are all, I mean, look, these are all like little crucibles or like
Yeah.
learning environments that we get to learn from. But yeah, Minnesota, let's see what happens next. I think it sounds like it's shaping up to potentially have a place for kind of maybe both paths. So we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting. And then Delaware, some good news there. Finally, they've been
Ish.
pushing. Yeah, they've been pushing for some time. Been blocked by the governor, who's a Democrat but not a fan. Just like the president, who's a Democrat but not a
Party
fan.
pooper.
Yeah, and I don't have the quote here, but I remember when I read this, he kind of like sounded like he's given up. He's just like, yeah, there's bigger fish to fry. I don't believe in it, but you guys want it, so fine. Like, I'll take my ball and go home. So he's gonna let it go, right? Marijuana legalization, the bill
Mm-hmm.
without his signature, right? Where he vetoed it last
Yeah.
time. So
Yeah.
that's good. I think what's interesting about Delaware, um, it's funny. What's interesting about Delaware, I'm in Delaware, besides all the C Corps being incorporated in Delaware, is Biden, that's his state, right? So he's going to see, hopefully firsthand, all the positive that happens for his constituents or, his prior constituents in that state, right? Jobs being created, the sky not falling. And not that he controls this stuff, but, if he's going to be a president again for another 4 years, might be good to have him on side a bit more. So that's some positive coming out of Delaware.
Yeah. The word is, though, they're going to slap a 15% tax on it, which we've already seen what that does to things in California and other markets. So that's kind of a lame move. And I mean, we also just know that people drive to adjacent states for better, cheaper, or even just legal weed. So I don't
True.
know. I mean, Pennsylvania is next up on deck if they can get an adult use program passed. I just don't think, if I'm in Delaware and I could go to PA and get it without that tax. I mean, we'll have to see what it all looks like, but I wondered if this was their way of saying, fine, you can have it, but we're really not going to give it to you.
We'll
But
set it up to
yeah, I mean,
fail.
it's
Yeah.
brutal. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know. It's I'll never understand. There's no business sense sometimes in politics, but that's probably why they're in politics and not in business, because it's not as, yeah, anyway, that's that.
Yep. So that's the legalization update this week. And then given that we're in May already, which is absolutely insane, I thought I'd pull some April numbers and just kind of see how we landed versus previous Aprils. And um, I don't know, there's not a lot of positive. Most markets are down April to April. But particularly like the legacy markets, they've had a really rough year to date. So markets like Colorado, year to date versus the same time frame last year, is down 16%. But when I look at
Yeah.
April to April, it's down 12%. So some of those challenges at the beginning of the year seem to be tapering off a little bit. So you're seeing some improvement. And the same thing is in Oregon, the same thing in Washington. Not as drastic. Oregon is 13% year to date, but only 11% April to April. Washington 10% year to date, 8% April to April. So you're seeing some kind of, it's coming back. It's not as bad, but it's still down. And the two markets that we track over here that are up significantly are Florida and Michigan. Although Michigan year to date's grown almost 50%, but April to April it's 26%. So it's a little bit different. So it might be cooling a little bit, some of that rapid growth. And Florida year to date 14%, and they had some really pretty good numbers in our April data, over 40% growth in April. And so that's pretty surprising to see, for sure. But as you mentioned when we were chatting about this a bit earlier, could be related to all the stores opening up, right? Lots going on in both of those markets, right? So these are top line, right? Total sales. Obviously, when you drill down into like store sales and things like that, in markets like Michigan, there is still the price pressure, right? Basket sizes are going, getting smaller, but there are more stores that are open, right? So more people are in the channel now purchasing legally. So the top line numbers in Michigan are good. Even though, some Michigan operators, it can be a bit tough, just depending on where you are, right? So that's kind of the dollars that we're seeing. And then I saw some things floating around on Twitter about, pricing and stabilization of pricing, like wholesale pricing of flower, I think nationwide. I don't know where that data comes from, this rebound, but in all the markets, we still see a lot of pricing pressure, and California being the largest. When I looked April to April, equivalized pricing and is basically per gram for flower, right? And that's a way to normalize across an eighth or 7 grams, 14 grams, what have you, right? So it's like the per gram pricing on average, and cost is down year over year, April to April, 17% in California, right? So almost 20% cheaper this year, the wholesale price going into the retail. Right. So what's getting sold into retail? Like I don't have data on what's getting sold into the producers, but what, the packaged products that are sold in retail, 17%, and equivalized price is 16.5%. So there's about a percentage point difference, but it looks like the price out the door isn't dropping as much as the cost. So the retailers are gaining a little bit there. Which is good. They're keeping a little more margin, even though margin has come down a little bit. So we're still seeing that pricing pressure. I don't know. I know I've seen people say, reports that the licenses aren't getting renewed and like wholesale and things like that because of the challenges in the market. And maybe that will impact it downstream or something. But so far, we're not seeing it on the retail side and what's going in to the retailers. All right. So that's it for April. And I think that's it for this week's podcast. Look, I want to be optimistic about safe banking. I think it's good news. I don't want to be like that cynic and all that. And I know we pointed out a lot of challenges, but that makes it all the more sweet when it does happen, right? So if it can navigate through this and come out the other side, that will just be an incredible accomplishment. So let's keep our fingers crossed and stay hopeful here, and hopefully we'll have some banking regulation before we know it.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.